Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight and we're excited to welcome you to our online event series, Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer. For this installment, he'll be chatting with David Davis about his new book, Wheels of Courage, How Paralyzed Veterans from World War II Invented Wheelchair Sports, Fought for Disability Rights, and Inspired a Nation. So you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to our host, Patrick, and tonight's featured author, David, for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started, there's just a couple of housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen, but the exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. But if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two little speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting them there and not in the chat. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Wheels of Courage, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in our bookstore locations from 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. Tuesday through Saturday, and you can purchase David's book and many others on site. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the U.S. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our host for this evening is Patrick Sauer. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of and even more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn Sports Writing Pipeline. He'll be speaking with featured author David Davis. He began his career as a journalist at the LA Weekly newspaper. He's the author of 5 books, including Waterman, The Life and Times of Duke Kahanamoku, and Showdown at the Shepherd's Bush, the 1908 Olympic Marathon, and the 3 runners who launched S Sporting Crate. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Sports Illustrated, Smithsonian Magazine, Deadspin, and Vice, and has been anthologized in the Best American Sports Writing series. Born and raised in New York City, he lives in Los Angeles with his 2 dogs and 2 old dogs and 2 young dogs. His new book, Wheels of Courage, is the inspiring story of the world's first wheelchair athletes, U.S. soldiers, sailors, and Marines who were paralyzed on the battlefield during World War II. They organized the first ever wheelchair basketball teams with VA hospitals after the war, which quickly spread across the nation and changed the perception and treatment of disabled people. For the disabled, for sports fans, for veterans, for history buffs, this is a narrative of hope, perseverance, and acceptance. David will be talking with Patrick and then with all of you. Please take it away.
Thank you, Katie. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you, Katie. Really appreciate it. Support independent bookstores. Yay.
Yes, I saw Vrolman's out on your part of the world is in trouble. So if you're a Vrolman's fan. So the book is great. It's one of those books where I knew nothing about the topic. And it's fascinating how in a very relatively short amount of time, a handful of veterans pretty much changed the way paralyzed soldiers and then beyond lived. I want to start by asking, how did you come to the story? What was your connection to it? Have you been fascinated by this? What brought you to Wheels of Courage?
Well, I was I had never heard of this, never heard of the origins of this. I knew vaguely about Paralympics and that sort of thing, but I had never really traced or figured out where it came from. I sort of stumbled onto this when I was doing research on the previous book about Duke Kahanamoku, the great Hawaiian surfer, ambassador of Aloha, and when I was looking at his life and times, he spent the 20s in Southern California trying to make it in Hollywood. And unfortunately, his skin color made him not available as a star, which he really should have been. But in terms of his life there, I was sort of tracing all that he was doing. And in the 20s, there was a swimming pool building boom. And, Hollywood stars would put swimming pools in their backyard. Institutions, schools, colleges would build swimming pools. And Duke was invited as a celebrity, Olympic gold medalist and star, to jump in the pool, and the press would write about it and so forth. So one of the places he went to was this amazing resort that was built about 50 miles east of Los Angeles, downtown LA. It's the city of Norco, next to the city of Corona. And this amazing resort happened to open at the start of the Depression. And it sort of quickly failed. And by the start of World War II, the Navy had bought it and converted it to a naval hospital. And that's where I ran into a team called the Rolling Devils, which I love the name of, and sort of sent me on that deep dive. And I was fortunate enough to meet one of the veterans who was still alive. I started reporting the book, and which I love the name of, and sort of sent me on that who was still alive when I started reporting. That's when I said, okay, this is a book. This topic goes beyond sort of just a magazine article or something like that.
Well, this book has so many fascinating characters, but the guy you talked to the most, was that John Winterhalter?
Article or something like that. Unfortunately, he had passed away. I talked with his son and daughter. The gentleman who I spoke with and met with, and I flew down to Texas to hang out with him, was Jerry Gene Fessenmeyer.
Oh, right. He's
the Iowa
extremely long names. Yes, okay. Let's start with him then. I wrote down the wrong name. Just tell us about him, because if nobody knows, you basically start with three main characters. There's like three main wheelchair characters and sort of three main, a doctor, a coach. But let's start with the guy you hung out with. Just tell us a little bit about him, and how he lived in the town in Mexico where he lived.
Yes.
Tell us about him. Yeah. He was great.
Yeah, he was an amazing man to get to know. Jerry Gene Fessenmeyer, he was a Iowa farm boy, but like a lot of young men at that time, just eager to fight for our country and eager to get in the battle. And he joined the Marines when he was still 17. He told me he literally jumped from the stage of his high school graduation to catch a bus to join the Marines in 1944, and came out to Southern California, Camp Pendleton, to train. And he was very realistic about his military service. He goes, I was trained to be fodder. He was basically trained to be cannon fodder. If the United States had invaded the home islands of Japan, he would have been part of that, and like he said, he probably would have died. Of course, President Truman decided to drop the atomic bomb, so he didn't have to do that battle, but he was in the Battle of Okinawa, and that was where he was wounded, shot by a Japanese sniper. And that was Okinawa was just just a messy, grueling battle for both sides. A lot of deaths, a lot of casualties. But Jerry was fortunate. He was but Jerry was fortunate. He was operating on an emergency level right beyond the front line, shipped to a hospital ship, and then taken directly to Hawaii to recoup a little bit, and then back to the mainland when he was healthy enough. And I mean, by the time he came home, he weighed about 70 pounds. And the other guys in the ward would play. He told me they placed bets as to whether he would live the night. And it speaks to really what the major part of why this sort of the story sort of resonates is that before World War II, if you were in Jerry Fessenmeyer's shoes, you would have died. There was no penicillin. There was no sulfa drugs. They didn't have the sort of the evacuation capacity that they had now in World War II. And you also had this system set up in the VA hospitals where they would help you get better. They took time for years that they had now in the rehab And part of the rehabilitation, and this took place at that Naval Hospital that I may help you mention in Corona, was recreation. And they took part of that was to get these men feeling a new orientation and getting them adjusted to the new normal, and saying that you're going to live, unlike the other paraplegics from the past, you're going to live a normal life. So we're going to help you transition to that. And one of that was sports. And Jerry was part of the Rolling Devils team, which was a short-lived team, but very important in its time here in Southern California. And after he left wheelchair basketball, he sort of lived, he was surviving his wounds, surviving his injuries. He said, I'm going to live life to the fullest. And he lived in Hawaii, he lived in Southern California. And as you mentioned, he went down to Mexico in its time here in Southern California, where there was a cohort of U.S. veterans. And if you want me to go into that a little bit, I will.
Veterans just living it up. And Guadalajara?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a little known story, and it started in the in the 50s. The veterans would go down to Mexico and specifically Guadalajara. There were so many that they eventually overran the city, and if you want, it was called Guadalajara, and they were and they could go brawling in the whorehouses, frankly, and the bars, and not care a whole heck of a lot. And there was the Korean War and then Vietnam War veterans joined them there.
That is a separate story I want to point out. I just wanted to make sure we got it in because I want to know everything there is to know about that.
A lot of Korean. No, that's a book in itself, right?
When you talked about, so this book basically runs from 45, I would say the meat of the book is 45 to 64, the Tokyo
Correct.
Olympics, and then you have some after that with the Vietnam and the formality of the Paralympics. But what I thought was interesting is in World War I, it's a death sentence, but at the time, I guess World War II from 40 to 45 or a few years after when guys are surviving, but there's no plan whatsoever. I mean, it's just sort of like you didn't die, but now you're just going to lay here. And so the sports really becomes not just a sort of way to get people out of bed, but this is like an incredibly healing thing because there's not really psychiatrists. There's not really, I think that's the part of the story that I had no idea that there was a period where, being paralyzed on the battlefield was no longer a death sentence, but they had no plan. It was like, you're going to just be here and die of infections, bed sores, like these other terrible things. And then a couple people have the idea, well, maybe we should get them up and moving around, at least to a degree.
Exactly. There were some groundbreaking doctors who broke from orthodoxy, and when I say that, I mean the care in the past with paraplegics was very, very crude. They would put them in full body cast, plaster body cast, and let them lay and sort of suffer in their sweat and muck. And that's how they ended up dying a lot of the time from the disease and the sepsis. This was a new generation of doctors, some of whom were educated in Europe. They had some experience, and these are doctors like Dr. Monroe in Boston area, Ernest Bors, who was out here in Southern California, and also in England, and there's a component in England, I'm sure we'll mention that as well, Dr. Ludwig Gutmann, who had fled the Nazis and ended up in London, outside of London, and he was running the spinal cord unit there. And they took a different approach, which was, let's get these guys up and moving. And part of wheelchair basketball as an origin, it was under the guise of rehabilitation. And that was an interesting facet in the sense of they recognized that these young men was under the guise of rehabilitation. And that was, there's a huge break from leading a normal life where you might have played high school or college sports, and now you have lost the use of your legs permanently. So what can you do to remedy that? What's the new normal? So there was vocational training, where you might have many of the veterans learned how to do first. And now you watchmaking and watchmaking repair, which was sort of something they could do in their chair. But it was also about exercising. And they would, as you can imagine, the shoulders, arms, chest that's really important for somebody who's lost the use of their legs to get themselves out of bed, to get them to wheel in their wheelchairs, that sort of thing. Because back then there were no electric wheelchairs or anything; it was all manual.
Well, it's also interesting. Hello, Dave. Welcome.
I thought I was early for 7:30 and I'm late for 7. Sorry, guys.
Well, you know,
hey man, in my defense, I was reading a really good book.
Blame it on.
I got nothing to blame it on.
It's the debate. The debate ruins everything.
Yeah, it hasn't even started yet. Anyway, go ahead. Hi, Dave.
So, but I was going to say before, one little wrinkle that I thought was fascinating in the book is that initially the doctors were like, wheelchairs are for losers. We're going to get you on crutches. Like their whole thing was to get them on crutches. And it's just one of those things where you sort of hear that and it's like, oh yeah, this is a terrible idea. We can do this in a chair. But it's funny that there was a period of crutches or nothing.
Right. And that harkens back to the image of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who obviously had passed away as president, had passed away in 1945 before the end of the war, of course. But for his entirety as president, from 33 to 45, this is someone who, as a young man, had been stricken by polio and did use a wheelchair. And yet he went at great pains to avoid being photographed in a wheelchair. There are very, very few photographs of him. And most of his biographers agree or state that much of the reason for Roosevelt's reluctance to be photographed in a wheelchair was the image. This is someone who would be perceived perhaps back then as damaged goods, as someone who is not fit to be president of the United States. And all of that implies. So to your point,
you mentioned something I never heard of. There was literal ugly laws, like we can't have disabled people on the streets.
I was just about to mention that, which is so crazy.
Shocking.
And that was
true.
Yeah, I mean, the level of stigma that, especially, that the athletes encountered coming back and stuff like that was, I mean, I guess it's a story that, of course, America was not nearly as far along as it is now. And if we're going to be honest, there's a ways to go if we're starting from now too. But the level of just, not just exclusion, but the way in which this was just sort of not thought about is really, I mean, I suppose I knew it, but it really makes the journey that people take over the course of the book that much more remarkable. That it's basically just like becoming people again, in a sense.
Agreed. And I mean, think about it just on a practical sort of level. There were no such thing as curb cutouts. There was no kneeling buses. There were no handicap parking spaces. All the things we take for granted. So to your point, when these veterans came home, they had nothing to sort of lean on. And it even goes so far as the wheelchairs themselves. And I know we're going to run a clip later, and just to alert the audience, we're going to run a clip, and you'll see those early wheelchairs. Before the mid-30s into World War II, for these veterans, wheelchair technology was basically a lazy boy, living room chair on wheels. So in other words, those people were shunted off to institutions or locked away sort of in the family home, and there was no sense of mobility. And these wheelchairs that the audience will see, and super crude by today's standards, but back then they were, a Rolls Royce, because the veterans could get in the chairs. they could wheel themselves out to a car, and these wheelchairs open the door, jump in the front seat, and then fold the super. Then they were, a Rolls Royce, because they could drive, and driving back then as today, that's freedom. That means you can go out and look for a job. That means you can go do, woo a young lady perhaps who might be interested.
Well, before we get into the basketball and the sports part, I think that's one thing we should discuss a little bit is the absolute ingenuity and improvement and engineering, and it's really inspiring stuff, including it's the first it's the first automatic transmission car is built because these wheelchairs can fold into it, right?
Yeah.
Well, they were just coming forth those cars, and they were able to convert the so that they could use hand controls. So you can't, if you're a paraplegic, you can't use the accelerator and the brake with your legs. You can't control that. So they had hand controls put on. And by the way, you mentioned that was one of the, when you talk about disability rights, the veterans fought for that. The paralyzed veterans fought for that. That was something they went to Congress, and one of the traveling teams, the Flying Wheels out of the Birmingham Hospital in Van Nuys, whenever they would make their road trips, they would stop in Washington, D.C. and lobby Congress and eventually the White House for accessibility, for fixes that will make them be able to have a job, own a home. They were able to lobby and get for extends to build for fixes that houses with ramps and widened doorways and things like that, so that they could live that quote unquote normal life, and including recreation and wheelchair basketball. To build houses.
Yeah, it's such an all-encompassing thing. Like, it wasn't, I guess, like I said, I had no idea how this came about. I would have assumed it was a slow sort of rehab kind of thing, but it was sort of like these guys really took over, and they're like, we're going to do this. They played their first game ever basically at Madison Square Garden. They have these teams building with these great names, and it just, the movements, pardon the pun, the literal movement of the thing is kind of astounding. It's one of the fastest moving civil rights groups, or whatever the word is. I don't recall anybody sort of having that many things happen positively in such a short amount of time that a lot of the country probably wasn't even thinking of, etc. But they really did just, we're going forward and deal with it.
Right. And it was also, I think it's important to note the context of the times. With World War II, the veterans, this country, let's face it, that at that time they embraced the veterans coming home. And obviously that's been different in other wars, but certainly in World War II, when the veterans came home and the wounded veterans, they embraced them. They were thankful, hey, you beat the Nazis and you beat back the Japanese Empire, and we welcome you and we want to embrace you. And the VA, to their credit, gave them time to heal, gave them space to sort of, again, adjust to this new normal. And then with providing recreation and so forth, allowed them to have outlets that would, at some point, once they left the VA hospitals, that's when wheelchair basketball sort of goes, I wouldn't say explode, it's a little, that's probably not the word I want to use, but mushrooms into something that goes beyond that. By the early 50s, we had the polio epidemics. So now you have the post-polio patients who can now join wheelchair basketball. So you have this mix of other young men joining as well.
There's something about the role that the VA plays in this. Am I coming through okay? I'm getting, the audio's hanging a little bit. All right. This is a story, as you tell it, and I think very well, of, people who became figures in this movement, athletes, doctors, people, the Reinerson fellow that basically wrote the rules and adapted, the Naismith's 13 rules to wheelchair basketball. And yet there is like that sense with the VA of this being in some ways an institutional success. I mean, for all that these guys won, and as you pointed out, as much as they had to fight to win it, politically, there's also the sense that this was like, it reflected the commitment that the country made in the war. I mean, the numbers, again, this is the sort of thing where like, maybe if I was less of a dummy, this would blow my mind less. But the stuff that you had in there about, 1 million Americans came back, were veterans. 650,000 people had suffered some sort of very serious injury fighting in this war. That like and I don't want to make this about, because this is my pledge, is that there will be zero electoral politics in this in any way. And I'm going to stick to that. And I hope you both will hold me to it. And yet that mobilization of care, it seems like it's at the heart of what makes all this possible. That like all of these people coming from this sort of idyllic seeming American background, like still couldn't have done it without this broader commitment that you talk about.
I also think not electoral politics, we'll say, for the younger generations, but we're all probably been X amount of years of each other. The Vietnam era, it was just such a different thing. Like, I mean, I'm 49, so I remember a little bit of the sort of Vietnam veteran problems. I remember when the wall was built and then the movie started and it was kind of a healing thing, but that was still 10 years after. I mean, I think that's what you're alluding to a little bit. For us, at least, it was like the war was so bad, except, and of course wars are bad, but it doesn't have the same thing. I think Dave is talking about it. Like, we need to help people that served our country in a way that you're right. I don't think Vietnam left a bad taste. And then I think the wars of the forever wars are just sort of like a thing that happens that we just tend to ignore.
It's like weather.
Yeah.
Right. And you make all good points. And it's interesting to note a couple of things. First of all, before FDR passed, he sort of made the commitment that the VA will take care of the wounded and the injured. So that was sort of set up early. Truman, a lot of people don't remember, was a World War I veteran. So he had military experience, and that was, I think, important moving forward. And his first appointee to head the VA in that transition of time was General Omar Bradley. Who, again, it wasn't a doctor, of course, but comes from a military standpoint. And that sort of attitude is, we take care of our own. And so they put in a lot of money, frankly. And you want to talk about electoral politics, there some that divided some political parties, because there were some who didn't want to spend all that money, frankly. And there were some odd allies there for a while. Yeah. But you're right. The commitment was there. The men were allowed to heal, and and certainly back then took a lot of time. Now, if God forbid you should have commitment was there, the men were allowed an accident or injured in war, Europe, and which sort of up out of the you're in your wheelchair and out of the hospital in a relatively short amount of time. Back then it took a lot longer because they were just figuring out how do we deal with this. But they gave them the time and they made that commitment, and I think that was a very important factor.
And I think it's worth mentioning. I think it's worth mentioning too, at a time that you don't think of race relations moving forward particularly quickly in the 40s and 50s, but you have Truman desegregates the military, and then the wheelchair guys, it sounds like, did fight for, they fought for better pay for all disabled veterans, but they seem to fight for the African American soldiers. And I guess that may be the one thing that, even less people can understand. It's like, if you're in a wheelchair, we are one in some way. I don't want to kumbaya because it wasn't perfect, but I thought that was interesting that they fought for Black soldiers when nobody was really fighting for Black soldiers.
No, it's true. It's true. And I mean, I went into this a little bit in the book, but it's a complicated issue, the GI Bill. Most scholars and academics who've analyzed the GI Bill, most people say, oh, it was this great bill and it really jump-started an economic boom and created this amazing middle class, and all these people had access to education and so on and so forth. All of that is true, but an economic boom and created this amazing middle class, sailors, etc. So that, just to note that. But you're right. I mean, once you got to paraplegia, it actually happened to integrate the spinal cord injury units. There was an anecdote told to me about that naval hospital in Corona. They opened the attendants opened the ambulance, and there was an African American sailor there, and they sort of looked at each other, going, what are we going to do about this? Because basically that town, the nearby town, was, let's just say, a little bit of a hotbed for the KKK, and the attendants sort of looked at each other and shrugged and said, we got to help this guy, and they rolled him in, and nobody said anything, or at least none of the military people said anything. And so, yeah, there was an element of that. I was on the lookout for sort of the Jackie Ryan, the attendance sort of. It's hard to trace that because some of the records, have sort of fallen to the wayside. But again, to your point with Truman desegregating, the armed forces, that's exactly the same time as Jackie Robinson is breaking the color barrier, with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so there's a little bit of a change going on in the world, and in a positive way, where there's some acceptance for the other, whether it's by skin color or a disability.
I was wondering if we could talk, and again, this is the sort of thing this is why they don't generally advise you to show up 22 minutes into a conversation. And again, my apologies very much on that. But I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about how you picked the athletes that you focused on. And if that happened during the first 20 minutes, that's, obviously I'm sure it was great, and I'll watch it when it goes up on YouTube. But Stan Den Adel and Johnny Winterhofer, like how did you discover them? Like the process of telling the story. Did you start with the athletes, or did you start with the sort of the sport itself?
Well, we should catch you up real quick. We actually did not talk about either of those two. We talked about I can't keep the name straight. We talked about the guy who ended up in the Mexican commune, the Mexican drug hooker commune, who's my hero.
Why did you start with that? That seems weird. It seems like a weird choice.
Yes.
Wouldn't you want something dramatic, like the guy from Wyoming that was really nice?
We didn't start with the guy from Wyoming, so here we go. Let's go to Wyoming.
Well, the guy from Wyoming was super interesting to me because he was, let's just say, and his name is Johnny Winterholler, and those of you hailing from Wyoming will remember that name, but before the war, he was a stud athlete who had pro potential, maybe in baseball or something like that. He actually played against Whizzer White when White was with Colorado back in the day. He was an interesting story just because he was the son of immigrants. He's out there in Wyoming, sort of out in the boondocks. And I thought his story was super interesting because of what happened with the war immigrants. He's out there, Johnny enrolled with an ROTC scholarship, and thus after his academic career, he enlisted in the Marines, and he was in the Philippines in 1941, way before Pearl Harbor. And he was part of the crew that was captured on Corregidor. There were press reports that he was part of the Bataan Death March, but he actually was not. But he was a prisoner of war until 1945, and that's how he became paralyzed, which was to say his body basically wasted away because he had the lack of nutrition and no medical care. So I thought that was an interesting dynamic, both him as a great athlete and then him as with the POW camps. And I had not known much about the Philippines, that part of the war. And I knew about the Pacific Theater in Japan, of course, but I'd always been focused on Pearl Harbor and then the other, Iwo Jima and the big battles. So I thought that was super interesting. And Stan Danadell, boy, it was vision and no medical. He ended up, what was so interesting about him is he had so much material about his life that he had, sort of bequeathed to his daughter who was adopted, and his sister was still alive. So I got it just was some great information. And just follow him, Stan Danadell was wounded in the European theater. So I wanted somebody, on that side of the Atlantic. He was wounded in the Stan Danadell, Battle of the Bulge. It was the waning days of the war, actually. And Danadell becomes a poster boy, I guess, or poster man for Paralyzed Veterans of America, PVA, and this feeling of we're going to live life to the fullest. Sort of bequeathed to him with some great information. He got his MBA from UCLA and had a long career with the Bank of America in a wheelchair back when, this was incredibly difficult to move around. And he built his own, actually, becomes a poster boy, I guess. That to me was incredibly compelling. And yeah, David, you missed that. Talked about the other gentleman who sort of lived a life of, hey, I'm going to live life to the fullest as well, but in a different way than Stan Danadell.
Yeah, the way of living life to the fullest that doesn't involve working at Bank of America, and in fact, this is the opposite of that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. He used the GI Bill.
Why?
It's difficult to move around.
On its face, it's kind of an obvious
he built his own house out in the
Why
Sacramento
basketball?
Valley.
Why was basketball important?
That to me
It seemed to be the only sport for a long time. It seems like there were a number of sports they could have tried, but sort of basketball took hold, and it seemed like a number of years where we could race, we could do archery, we could play ping pong, whatever, but basketball was the sport. Just talk about how that developed.
Some of it was I could have practical, but we think of basketball as correct. Some of it was practical.
Hey, David, hold on a second.
I'm a little slow.
Yeah.
Cut out there for a second.
We think of basketball as
come back.
Certainly an indoor one is flat. Oh, am I still here?
No, it's your audio. I don't know what it is. I missed some of your answer there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I don't think there's anything you're doing wrong.
Okay. Well, what I was saying was a basketball court, indoor one, it's nice and smooth and flat. Am I still here? Smooth and flat. It's a big enough surface you can really move. Watching today, watching elite wheelchair basketball is a revelation, and I highly recommend people checking that out. I think a lot of people remember, the wheelchair rugby. This is a different sport, and so anyway, you were asking about that. So it just took off, wheelchair basketball. Think about it. Let's say like baseball. Think about if you had an outdoor grass field, trying to wheel one of those older wheelchairs, in the dirt and the grass, just wasn't practical. So it sort of swept and became the thing until the late 50s, early 60s, when, as you mentioned, it expands to track and field, so to speak, and then eventually marathoning, and then all sports. And there was even a coterie of winter sports. You have the first, some of the World War II veterans who fought in the mountains, very elite crew so it sort of were skiers. When they came back, they made adaptive skiing something for amputees. So that was super interesting. And the contrast is with what was happening in England with Dr. Ludwig Gutmann, who's known as sort of the godfather of the Paralympics. He starts with archery. And again, it's that feel, that sense of exercising the chest and the shoulders and the arms, because that's so important for paraplegic. And then they also played in England a game called netball, which I had never heard of before doing this book. And it's like a distant cousin of basketball, but it's played without a backboard, netball. So that's sort of how that developed. And there were attempts of other sports like seated volleyball and things like that, but it never got sophisticated like wheelchair basketball did here in this country.
One thing that you mentioned in there, which I thought was interesting, because the little bits of wheelchair basketball that I've seen, it's incredibly violent. Like, not violent in the sense of like, you know, the way that war is violent. It is way more hardcore than like regular, beyond like regular basketball. I mean, it's a great deal of contact. They're moving at this crazy high rate of speed. They're crashing into each other. That like element of the sport, I think, has like, there's something about the way that it evolved that seems, if you're somebody that wants to do something that feels more like real life and more like a real sport, like this is so much more like that than archery or, you know, volleyball or whatever. You talk about the first game at Madison Square Garden when they were playing and people falling out of their chairs and the crowd like gasping in sort of like horror, like not being able to believe that, you know, that this was safe. And the bravery of the athletes, there's some great like gallows humor bits in there where anytime there's like a collision like that, you know, when the game was first getting started, they'd be like, I'm in a wheelchair and I'm going to be here for the rest of my life. Like, I'm not worried about that. Like, I'm not worried about falling over. I wear a diaper. Like, you don't understand. And that is, I don't know, that spirit really sort of animates the athletic part of the book in a really interesting way, I think.
Absolutely. And you're right. I mean, watching the game today, it's very, when you say violent, there's just a lot of collisions, and it's a natural part of the game in terms of positioning and pick and roll. So it's a lot of screaming and yet when you see the manipulation, and I can't do it here in my little seated chair here, but when you see the athletes manipulate the chairs, moving back and forth and at high speeds, and dealing with the ball and the opponents, it's a marvel. But that early days, and I think we have a clip. I don't know when you guys want to show that, but we do have a clip of that Madison Square Garden game. And I mean, beyond just sort of the crude wheelchairs that you'll see, and those were the old Everest and Jennings, and the back of that Madison Square Garden. The rules were not sophisticated back then, but certainly and those were the old style, that sort of freewheeling style was captured, and and the rules. The game at Madison Square Garden was super important. Obviously, being in New York, within a couple weeks, that one of the stars was on the cover of Newsweek, and every major newspaper and magazine covered these guys because of both the acclaim, but also just sort of that Jeebus. Like, this is amazing that these guys are overcoming this and ready to move on, and within a couple of weeks, one of the quote unquote normal life.
Well, that's a good time then. Katie, you want to show the clip?
Yeah, let's do that.
And this is a clip, just to set it up a little bit. This is a clip of a team from Framingham, Massachusetts, Cushing VA Hospital. Just to set it up a little bit. A team from Cushing VA Hospital, and they're playing a team from Framingham, Massachusetts, the Halloran 50s in terms of streets. And this was played before a Knicks game.
What year are we talking?
This is 48. And you can see on the sidelines, there's veterans. They had pulled out and that's what they had pulled out the front row to allow other veterans to come and watch the game. And you can see all those veterans sort of lining up.
You are not lying about these chairs, man. Those are not built for speed.
No. And yet they were state of the art. I mean, when these guys when these guys went over to England to start playing in the Paralympics in the 50s, the British were amazed. Like, these were the Porsches. these were the Porsches.
They were 100% wood. Yeah.
Oh, look at that! Look at that pass, though.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
actually, it's a very pleasing, especially given the version of basketball that was being played at the professional level by NBA
Right.
players at the time. That's actually way more fun and freewheeling than like Bob Pettit standing there looking like a tall version of me with his hand.
George Mikan. Just,
Yeah, right. It's like, well, Pettit was actually cool, I guess. But yeah, Mikan was a big dorky looking guy.
And that was the day before the 24-second clock. So yeah, you're right. The basketball was just, very tight shorts and set up the offense and very low scoring.
Yeah,
And
playing in
that,
the 40s.
that game that was fun.
why did they? What I found was funny though is like all these professional teams played in chairs, like like the Celtics played them, and they were in wheelchairs also. Like, why didn't they just have wheelchairs? Like people who knew what they were doing, because the scores are all like 42-2, and the Celtics lost because they aren't in wheelchairs.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, partly that was they were those were fundraisers a lot of times. So they would match up, as you say, against the Celtics, who would borrow wheelchairs, and the veterans would kick their butts because they knew how to manipulate the wheelchair. But it was a device to raise funds for the Paralyzed Veterans of America, and that money went to research paraplegia in the hopes of quote unquote finding a cure. And it also had the other, like that game at Madison Square Garden, it had the other side effect of showing thousands of people that disabled people with disabilities could be great athletes. And here they are beating, the Celtics and the Knicks and the Globetrotters. So there was something impressive, I think, about that. So turning the tide.
What you lose in game quality, you get in messaging, which is, it's a trade-off you have to make. Should we do the questions? I know that I'm like raring to go and getting into it, but you guys we're done at 8, right? So we should.
Well, we were like we waited a few minutes. Yes, ask the question.
So the question that we have from Paul Feinberg to David, you mentioned the Paralympics. How did the sport evolve into the Olympics and Paralympics?
Okay. Hi, Paul. Thanks for the question. There were these two sort of parallel lines going on at the time. There was the British, who I mentioned under Ludwig Guttmann. He had fled the Nazis right before the war. He was a German neurosurgeon. He fled the Nazis. He ended up in England, and he was eventually put in charge of the spinal cord injury unit at Stoke Mandeville. And he had the same philosophy. Recreation is good, vocational training is good, and he was the one who brings out the archery and netball that we discussed earlier. Pittman was an amazing promoter and very, very savvy. And in fact, the first time he held the Stoke Mandeville Games, which are the precursor to the Paralympics, it was the same day as the opening ceremony of the London Olympics of 1948. So he always had in his mind that this would be, or in his mind, that this would be the equivalent. And in about 1952 or 3, they coined the phrase Paralympics, and it's meant specifically for people with paraplegia. So you have at the same time the Americans playing wheelchair basketball, as we discussed. In about 1955, the first U.S. team goes over to England to play in the Stoke Mandeville Games. And Guttmann knew that at this point, for the Paralympic, for his games, so you have Stoke Mandeville Games to get bigger, you needed the Americans. You needed because they are the best athletes, and also they have those cool early wheelchairs, the Everest and Jennings wheelchairs. And the Americans come over. It's the Pan Am Jets team, and frankly, they kicked everybody's butt. And even in netball, which they had never played before. And that's sort of, once that happens, once you have these two strands of wheelchair sports, that sort of sets it ablaze. And Guttmann makes the commitment in 1960, working with some Italians, to hold the Stone Mandeville Games in Rome after 1960. You needed there to happen the Olympics, which were in Rome. And so that's generally conceived of as the first Paralympics because it follows directly on the heels of the Rome Olympics. And then, as Patrick had mentioned before,
I was going to say, what happens? So you have 60 Rome, 64 Tokyo, where they really get the red carpet, and then Mexico City's like, nah, we don't want this, and they don't have it in 72 or 7. Why did they drop it, and why? When did it didn't come back till 84? Is that right?
So 88. There were games. Wow. Yeah, there were games going on all throughout, but not in the host city. Yes, right. Of the Olympic cities. There wasn't the formal agreement between the Paralympics and the Olympics, and that was a whole other thing. That was partly why I ended the narrative of the Olympic cities. It wasn't the formal. I was like, okay, that's enough. But in all seriousness, they were still during the 1960 Olympics, but they just were in different cities than the host cities. So. And you mentioned Los Angeles in '84. We didn't have the Paralympics, but we had 2 wheelchair races that happened. Sorry. Yes, they're considered exhibition. So 88 games. Yeah, there were big games, but they just were in different cities. So that was also a big moment for the Olympics and the Paralympics as they joined together.
Should we open it up for more questions, or is there
is there another question?
I don't see another one right now. Does anybody have
anyone else has a question, send it along. I want to ask one thing about where we are now. It seems like 2012 London really this is they fully united, and that like this is going forward will be the Olympics, Paralympics, much more of a united kind of front. Is that, am I right on this? Where's the state of Paralympics?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And the Olympic Games have taken a lot of bad PR, have taken a lot about, exorbitant costs, building stadiums that become, white elephants very quickly. The whole bidding and bribery within the Olympics. So, the Paralympics sort of offers, to the Olympics, I think, some good PR. And what you've seen is just a greater sophistication, in Paralympics in terms of the equipment, the wheelchairs and things like that. And yes, by opening up the Paralympics to other disabilities, it really has opened up the pool of athletes. So I think they're doing quite well. I mean, obviously the support has to be there from the Olympic movement, and fans have to buy tickets and all that sort of thing. But yeah, now they are closely committed. Colorado Springs just opened up and it's called the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic, Hall of Fame and Museum. And it just opened, but nobody knows about it because of the virus. Nobody can travel. But they made sure that the Paralympics was included. That thing from the Olympic movement. And I think by now, now they are closely committed. Colorado.
Do you? I was going to ask. Do these guys now have? Are they like sponsored and they have like fully money behind them as well?
Sure, the elite athletes in Paralympics, absolutely, they are. I mean, and I think I can't remember. I don't remember if it's Netflix or HBO, but there's a whole documentary coming out on Oscar Pistorius, or a feature film on him. Obviously, he has his scandals. I mean, that's happening.
We don't talk about him really.
Sure. The elite athlete people are absolutely they are. If it's Netflix, or sure. check you out, but it's very engaging to watch.
I know this is not about like my opinions on the Olympics,
that's happening, so,
but to me, there's
I think
always
people are taking more
been
interest,
like an extent to which the Olympics are.
that's
Hang on, I'm
happening
getting
with
some feedback.
So,
Yeah,
I mean, I think
good
people
now.
are taking more of an interest in, the
That as cheesy as everything around the Olympics always is, like as cynical and as you were saying, like the white elephant problem and the sort of the graft that attends all of it, they somehow wind up just pulling it off every 4 years because the sports are so good. That like it gets as bad as it can possibly get, and then the purity of intent and form of the athletics somehow winds up redeeming it. And it just gets you back to zero, and it doesn't fix the fact that you're Rio and you're stuck with all this sort of crumbling diving infrastructure that you don't need or whatever. But what I liked the book. I mean, I had to read it very fast, and I did not finish it because I obviously, am not doing great. But the way that the sports stuff works in it is like, I don't like to use words like inspiring where sports stories are concerned, because there's always so many other moving parts and so many other less inspiring, sort of human elements. The people in this book are fantastic. Like, it really is like what you want in a sports story. I've gotten to edit David at 3 different websites, and this is like not just like the primo David Davis stuff, but this is like really, it feels like the apotheosis of like the type of story that you've written, where there's this element of like super hardship that approaches mythic, like unfairness. And then, just the formalizing of like sports helping to like sort of organize that and make it manageable or something that makes sense.
That's first of all, that's very kind of you. I'm going to put a primo David Davis on my
go ahead.
board.
I'm sorry I was late with my blurb too. My bad.
It's a beautiful thing. And I mean, what I tend to agree with you. And to your point about the Olympics, every year, every 4 years, every 2 years, they pull it off, and it is amazing. And I'm someone who over the years has gone to quite a few, both as a spectator, mostly as a spectator, a couple times as a journalist. And, for the winter games take that to a whole other level. Maybe not so much about Salt Lake City, but in terms of the athletes and even the spectators, when you have to like walk up a mountain to watch a race, that tends to make that race and that contest mean something. And you see I mean, we all know about Lindsey Vonn or somebody like that, a big superstar, but you're also seeing, the dude from, Lithuania or Liechtenstein, he's the only dude on that country's squad or whatever. And you're like, good for you, man. Good for you. Yeah. Got it on your resume.
Like, it's like basically like, think about how good that shit has to be to cancel out a bunch of like just gross guys in suits passing envelopes of money back and forth, and yet somehow that does it. That's how good the Lithuanian guy story is.
You want to hear something funny? A story I wrote for Vice. So my favorite bar in the entire world it's called the Golden Guy in Tokyo. Anyway, they're all about 8 feet long, and you can fit like 3 people in them. And the woman who runs it, her name is Meow. It's Barku. It's very hippie vibe. And she shows Paralympics. She has like Deaf Night where everybody has to try to talk in sign language. She has all these things that she does for the disabled. She's amazing. The story I wrote at Vice was, will the Golden Guy survive the demolition for the Olympics? There had been plans for the Yakuza was going to burn it down and sell it, blah, blah, blah. She survived, and then the Olympics didn't. Like, her whole big Olympic thing. Like, I wrote it like, this is going to be terrible. She doesn't make it. And she made it. And I'm like, fantastic. Oh, well, there you
go. It sounds like, honestly, that's like a pretty happy ending, all told.
I mean, it's O. Henry-esque, but it's still there.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one other question before we close out. Since he's in your book, and I know you did a show with him, his book was a huge inspiration to me in high school, and also the movie, which I don't remember that well. I haven't seen it in years. But Ron Kovic, how's he doing? What is? I once tried to get to him for an interview about Country Joe McDonald. He's like, I'm not really getting interviews, so you got him to speak for the book. And I'm just curious, how is he? What did his life become? such an inspiration as a writer and
Yeah.
as a figure.
I appreciate you asking. Yeah, as most of you know, Ron Kovic wrote Born on the 4th of July, which became the movie with Tom Cruise. He lives here in Southern California in the South Bay, which is by the beach, Redondo, Hermosa Beach, I forget which. And yeah, he's doing okay. He is writing another book. I'm not sure if it's a memoir or fiction, but he's certainly still with it and engaged. And yeah, I'm hoping one of these days soon we'll be able to meet again face to face. But he was very generous and because most of the, as I explained before, most of the veterans had passed away. Ron, even though it's a different war and it's Vietnam, was able to give me this perspective of what is it like for a young man, 20, 21, to have your life, changed forever, and this healthy body that's in shape for war, and now you're in a wheelchair for life. And he was able to help explain, all of the trauma psychologically that you go through. What are you, how are you going to live? How are you going to make it? Are you going to be able to have sex again, or have kids, etc.? And so he gave me that perspective, helped give me that perspective, which was very important in terms of informing the book. So, yeah, it was a huge help.
Right as well.
Well, we are past time. I want to apologize. We had a lot of issues this evening that we have not had. I think I'm going to just blame it all on the debates. It's the bad juju in the air.
It was probably fine until I showed up. I'm happy to wear that one.
We've had a few.
It was off the rails. Well, before I leave, can we agree to meet in Tokyo next year at the Golden Guy? Come on.
Barku. You know what? If you go, I'm gonna post my article on Barku, not just because I wrote it, because Meow is wonderful. I went back again. I ended up in Japan, and we took our daughter there at some very inappropriate hour. But she was happy to see us.
Honestly, given the description of the bar, you showing up with your daughter does not sound like the weirdest thing that probably even happened that night.
It's I described as the size of a grand piano, which she thought was very entertaining. I'm gonna put it up. She's great. Hello, Meow. All right, two quick things. The next one of these is on October 8th. It is a book called Love, Zach. It is by Reed Forgrave. It is not like Wheels of Courage. It is, in fact, sort of the opposite. Is a story of a high school football player who got CTE and took his life at a very young age, an Iowa kid. And it is deeply disturbing, but Reed was there from the beginning. The family wanted the story told. And it's definitely worth your time. And then after that, we have our first foray into fiction. I will not be here. Dave will be here with special guest host Megan Greenwell, Nerd.com editor, former EIC editor-in-chief at Deadspin. And it is a book called The Red Shirt by first-time novelist Corey Sobel. It is about a closeted gay college football player whose roommate is a top recruit who seems to hate football. That will probably be one worth checking out because we've never done fiction, and I don't have to pretend to have any literary insight.
And you can watch me and Megan like argue about the A's and stuff. Who doesn't want to see that? But yeah, and I'll be on time for both of those events.
You should forgive yourself, Dave.
I can't.
So, like I said, we had some technical things on all around tonight, but whatever. Wheels of Courage, I don't want to hold up, but it's really a fascinating book about a sport that you're aware of, but probably don't know any of the details of. And it really does, like Dave said, it gives you a kind of good sense about American ingenuity and know-how and community and all the things that I've been joking about that we're going to lose in about 50 minutes. It's like a nice break from
Yeah.
all of this.
Treat yourself.
Yeah, you won't feel bad.
Well,
the
after
other thing,
the war parts are bad, but after that, it gets really nice.
true, but we don't have to harp on that.
Yeah.
Thank you guys, and thank you, Greenlight. Support independent bookstores. Thank you.
Yes, Katie,
Thanks.
can you take us out?
Yeah, thanks so much for that fantastic discussion, everybody. And thanks to all of you for joining us. If any of you missed any of tonight's discussion, or if you just want to watch it again, that will be posted on our YouTube channel, so please look out for it there. And don't forget to buy your copy of Wheels of Courage in store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.